Well, hello, church history friends, and welcome to an all-new lecture series. My name is Barbara Walden, and it's a joy to welcome you to our first program in the Stories of the Scattered Saints Fall 2022 lecture series. Thank you for joining us. I hope you're as excited as I am to explore the stories of the people and the places connected with this fascinating period of Latter-day Saint history. Now, joining me today is my co-host, Peter Smith. Peter is taking care of all the behind-the-scenes magic that comes along with an online series. Peter serves as a board member for the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation and as co-host of our Historic Sites bus tours. In fact, we are working on all the fine details right now for our next bus tour taking place in October of 2023. So be sure to stay tuned for all the exciting details, which we're hoping to share with you later on in this series. Now, this lecture series is not only a great way to learn church history, it's also an opportunity to help support church heritage. Donations received during the lecture series will go to developing new educational programs, fund the Alma Blair internship program, and to continue our ongoing support for the maintenance and preservation of all 5 Community of Christ historic sites. Peter will drop the online donation link and mailing address into the chat. So thank you all for your support. Now, joining us today from Kirtland, Ohio, is Seth Bryant. Seth is not only one of our presenters today, he's also a co-host that you will be seeing throughout the lecture series. Seth received a Bachelor of Science in English from Westminster College, a Master of Arts in Religious Studies from the University of Florida, and a Master of Arts in Religion from Vanderbilt University. Seth has served on the board of directors for the John Whitmer Historical Association and the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. He was editor of the Restoration Studies Journal, and Seth has published a number of articles in the Restoration Studies and the John Whitmer Journal, in addition to co-authoring a chapter on Latter-day Saints in the Oxford Handbook of Religious Conversion, which was published in 2014. Seth served as the site director of the Kirtland Temple in Kirtland, Ohio from 2017 through 2020, and he is now working for the VA at a vet center, which provides counseling to combat veterans. So we welcome Seth and thank you for joining us this evening. Also joining us today from along the Mississippi River in Nauvoo, Illinois, is Lachlan Mackay. Lach was the first paid full-time site director at the Kirtland Temple when he began in 1993. And he continued as the site director until 2002, when he began serving as the director or team lead overseeing all Community of Christ historic sites. It's a position he's held for 2 decades now. Lachlan also serves as a member of the Council of 12 Apostles for Community of Christ. And we welcome Lach this evening. So for tonight's program, the 3 of us are going to take a look at some of the artifacts related to various Latter-day Saint leaders who were active during this Scattered Saints period. Lach is going to start us off with a brief look at the secession crisis and some good old-fashioned historical context. So I'll turn things over to you, Lach.
So a review for many of you, but we'll move there quickly. Of course, Joseph and Hiram Smith are assassinated June 27 of 1844 in Carthage, Illinois. At that point in time, many of the church leaders were out on campaign missions for Joseph's run for US president. And Sidney Rigdon had removed back to Pennsylvania as part of his efforts as the vice presidential candidate with Joseph. So there was, of course, initially a question of what to do next. Emma initially supported William Marks based on a section from Kirtland. I think it's Community of Christ section 104, LDS section 107, that talks about how the First Presidency is equal in authority with the Traveling High Council, who are equal in authority with the Standing High Council, who are equal in authority with the Presidents of 70. And anywhere the church was organized, the stake president is in charge. And in the rest of the world, the Traveling High Council is in charge. The apostles So based on that, William Marks, as the president of the Nauvoo stake, the seat of church government, some historians have argued had the best claim to succeed Joseph. And of course, he also was opposed to polygamy, so Emma was a fan. Others, of course, supported Brigham Young, and Marks supported Rigdon, but others supported Brigham Young, including those who were in on the secret practice of plural marriage in Nauvoo, as well as many, many of the thousands of English converts from the UK who had gathered to Nauvoo. Folks outside of Nauvoo, members in scattered branches, really had no idea what was going on. They weren't familiar with a lot of the secret teachings in Nauvoo, so they're just kind of out on their own. So I love to think, and this was a volunteer that years ago used this imagery, but she talked about the first 14 years of the church as like a tree trunk, and with Joseph's death in 1844, the branches of the tree form. And so you see on the screen now a number of leaders of those branches of the Latter-day Saint tree. So Sidney Rigdon, who was the only surviving member of the First Presidency, is also a member of the Council of 50. Of course, Joseph Smith III, who'd been designated by his dad to succeed him and had the Smith lineage. William Smith, the only surviving Smith brother, also an apostle and a member of the Council of 50. James Strang, who had a letter of appointment that he understood to be from Joseph. William Marks, we've touched on, president of the Nauvoo stake and a member of the Council of 50. David Whitmer, who had been designated by Joseph as his successor at some point, one of the three witnesses. Lyman Wight, member of the 12, also part of the Council of 50. Brigham Young, president of the 12, also a member of the Council of 50. And Alpheus Cutler, a member of the Council of 50. I keep talking about the Council of 50. That would become very important. They were literally trying to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. And they would argue about things like who was senior over who in the Council of 50 as they began to squabble about succession. This slide shows you where folks scatter to as we talk about the scattered saints. And we'll return to this map many times tonight. It just gives you an idea of where folks end up taking their followers across the US and beyond. Back to you.
One name that doesn't appear on this map is William Marks, and probably because he didn't lead any of the Latter-day Saint groups on his own, but he sure was considered a potential successor for a brief period. And as Lach mentioned, Emma seemed to throw her support behind William Marks. Marks served as a bishop in Kirtland following Newell K. Whitney. He also served as the stake president in Nauvoo, like Lach had mentioned. So Marks was no stranger when it came to church leadership. The only problem was that Marks didn't see himself as church president. So he didn't throw his hat in the ring, but instead he threw his support behind Sidney Rigdon. As Rigdon was the only remaining member of the First Presidency, William Marks supported him. Now, the artifact I have for William Marks is this vest. Of all his contributions to the movement, one would never guess he was also doing it in such style with this fancy vest. Talk about a Latter-day Saint fashion influencer. I just love it. Now, William Marks and his wife, Rosanna, were close friends with Emma and Joseph Smith. So when Emma and her family left Nauvoo for a brief period of time in 1846, she relocated up the river with the Marks family. William Marks was a seeker through and through, and he moved around quite a bit when it came to Latter-day Saint groups during this period. He joined James Strang's movement for a while, but left around the time Strang began practicing polygamy. Marks joined Charles Thompson's movement briefly as well, before ending up with the reorganization in the late 1850s. William Marks and Zenas Gurley presided over the 1860 General Conference at Amboy, and he assisted with Joseph Smith III's ordination. Marks also served as a counselor in the First Presidency under Joseph Smith III as well. Now, his vest was donated to the Women's Department of the RLDS Church in the 1920s by Miss William H. Dean, is what the gift deed says. Her family treasured this vest for over 50 years, thinking of it as a family treasure. prior to giving it over to the church in the 1920s. The women's department encouraged church members during this time to donate any historic items that their family possessed, the idea that it would go in a new Heritage Hall Museum exhibition. It appears the Deems were motivated by this invitation, and that's when they donated Mark's vest to the church. Now, as I mentioned earlier, William Marks initially threw his support behind Sidney Rigdon when it came to the leadership crisis. So I'm going to hand it over to Seth to tell us more about Sidney Rigdon.
So I am in Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon's historic home in Kirtland. It's right across the street from the temple. And on this picture here, if you look, the first floor in the middle, that's where the original structure is at. There's been many additions over the years, but I'm in the original portion. And one way we know that is the floor joists underneath me, still, many of them still have the bark on them. They're logs. So I'm excited to be in this space because it's an important space within early church history. And specifically, it's the space where apostles were set apart to go on the very first mission outside of North America to England. So I should back up though, and I should mention, we have a connection here with Rigdon and Bickerton. So as Rigdon attempted to form his own church after the death of Joseph Smith Jr., he had among his followers Bickerton, who ultimately put the pieces together when Rigdon's ideas fell apart. Rigdon started a communal organization called the Adventure Farm, if I'm remembering correctly. Love the name, falls apart, Bickerton puts the pieces back together. So we have that connection here with the Rigdon home to that branch of the church. But I want to go back to the apostles. All right, so it's June of 1837. Heber C. Kimball is seated at the sacrament table inside the temple, and Joseph Smith comes to him and says, whispering, "Brother Heber, the Spirit of the Lord has whispered to me, let my servant Heber go to England and proclaim my gospel and open the door of salvation to that nation." Well, Heber C. Kimball was overwhelmed by that task and that mission. He said it was almost more than I could bear. I felt my weakness and unworthiness as I was ready to sink under the task. So Heber prays. Eventually he feels ready, and they come to this space right here that I'm in, into the Rigdon's home, where the presidency of the church holds a leadership conference, and that's where they set apart Heber C. Kimball. In his journal, he writes, "The presidency laid their hands on my head and set me apart for this mission and dedicated me to the Lord." And then he continues in his journal that Orson Hyde had walked in while this setting apart was taking place, and he expressed, quoting, he expressed a strong desire to accompany his fellow apostle to England. So the two of them then are set apart. And then shortly after that, Willard Richards had just returned from a mission to the east. He is set apart to go. And so the three leave. Oh, and I should add, we have Joseph Fielding as well is added. So these this core group leaves for England on 13 June 1837, and they arrive in New York the beginning of July, and then to England 19 days later. It's a pretty amazing history in this space right here. All right, well, I will turn things over to Lach. Oh, I should say, no, I'm not. I'm going to actually show you. I'm going to walk outside to the temple so you can see just how close we are. So bear with me here. Sorry about moving my screen. All right. We're just going to go like this. Okay. So here's that front door that you could see in that picture. And now I am going to go across Chillicothe Road to the temple. I am not jaywalking, but it wouldn't be the first time a saint broke the law in Kirtland. So here we go. All right.
Seth is risking his life for church history. We are all witnesses.
All right, let's talk a little bit about another of those branches, Alpheus Cutler. The image you see here, the man was passed down through 5 generations of Cutler descendants as Alpheus. I got to say, I think it looks pretty young to be Alpheus based on the clothing. That looks to me like an 1850s image. And he's getting up there by that point in time, maybe yeah, 60s or so. So maybe even a little older. So I don't know, that's intriguing. But 5 generations of the Cutler family understood that to be Alpheus. So he was a stone mason. We won't be seeing him today, but we have in our collection here in Nauvoo a number of his masonry tools that he would have used on the Nauvoo temple. He also, as we talked about, was a member of the Council of 50 as of 1844. And after Joseph's death, he led the 3rd company out of Nauvoo. And according to the Joseph Smith Papers biography, established or selected the spot for winter quarters. He also eventually established the town of Manti in Iowa, near Shenandoah, Iowa. That happened in 1850. And he began to be disaffected, but it was really interesting the way that his relationship with Brigham Young and the 12 evolved. They excommunicated many of the people following Alpheus, but kind of left him alone for the longest time. But finally, they had enough and excommunicated him as well. He established the Church of Jesus Christ in 1853. And following his death, a number of his folks end up in Clitheroe, Minnesota. They're still members of the Church of Jesus Christ today in Independence, Missouri. Next slide, please. And the artifact we're going to look at that belonged to Alpheus is his Nauvoo Legion sword. The Legion, of course, was chartered by the Illinois State Legislature. It's part of the Illinois State Militia, but Joseph Smith was given the rank of Lieutenant General as part of that charter. And I think that's happening because Joseph had been illegally court-martialed in Missouri and sentenced to death. And he believed that in order to be court-martialed, somebody had to outrank you. So if you're the only lieutenant general in the land, you are protected from the abuse of the court-martial system. I think that's what's happening. But it was not unusual for Nauvoo to have a state militia unit. What was unusual was our passion for it. We really embraced it in a way that ended up scaring our neighbors. There's probably 3,000 men or so in the Nauvoo Legion at a time when the U.S. standing army had only about 8,000 men. So it caused some questions among our neighbors about why a religious community would need a militia that large. And at times, people who visited Nauvoo would see the Legion participating in church events, and they were more uncomfortable with the relationship between the state militia unit and the church. So that led into some of the difficulties here. Alpheus was appointed a guard in the Nauvoo Legion in March of 1841. And the sword that you see here looks very much like other Nauvoo Legion swords. For example, we also have Joseph Smith Jr.'s Nauvoo Legion sword in the collection. It's really quite similar to this one. And this was donated to us by Birch Whiting, a common name among the Cutlerites, in 1954.
All right. Well, Cutler is interesting, and equally interesting is that of James Strang. He led a group at Voree, Wisconsin, and then later up to Beaver Island, which is located in Lake Michigan, close to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. James Strang was an attractive leader for many Latter-day Saints during this period. He had a familiar origin story that included a visit by an angel after the death of Joseph Smith Jr. He discovered plates that were later translated into scripture. He also had a letter of an appointment that he said was written by Joseph Smith and sent from Nauvoo before Joseph's death. The letter appointed Strang to be Joseph Smith's successor. So a number of early Latter-day Saints were quite interested in Strang as the new leader of the movement. The artifact we have from James Strang today is a scepter, which you see here. In 1850, Strang took on the prophetic office of king, and there was a coronation ceremony that took place in Beaver Island. George J. Adams, who was an early church member and missionary, who later joined James Strang, well, he had a heavy hand in this coronation ceremony. There was a red robe involved along with the scepter and a crown for Strang to wear. Interestingly, the crown was made by Elvira Eliza Field, Strang's first plural wife, and we will hear all about her on November 3rd when Amy De Rogatis shares in the lecture series. She's going to share that life and legacy of Eliza Field. So Strang was a pretty significant Latter-day Saint leader during this period. Some of those who joined Strang for a period of time included names that'll sound familiar to you. People like Martin Harris and John Page, John C. Bennett and William Marks, Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley, just to name a few. Strang's followers also had possession of the Kirtland Temple for a brief period of time in the late 1840s. And I'm going to send it over to Seth, who's at the Kirtland Temple, to share a few thoughts on Strang and the Kirtland Temple.
All right, so I'm in the lower court of the Kirtland Temple. Right behind me are the Melchizedek pulpits, and this would be the sacrament table that Heber C. Kimball was at when he received that mission call. So we fast forward 2 years past the deaths of Joseph and Hiram in Nauvoo. It's 1846, and local Latter-day Saints here have taken possession of the temple and aligned themselves with Strang. So Strang announces in the Nauvoo Herald, he says that his followers in Kirtland, quote, were in full legal and peaceable possession of the temple. They hold it by legal title, end quote. So William Smith, William aligns himself with just about everybody at some point. William Smith, who was a follower of Strang at that point, writes to Strang and suggests that a wall be built around the temple and, quote, to help keep possession. So somehow that wall was going to establish, their claim and their right, the Strangite claim to the temple. Now the Strangites hold a conference here. They hold several meetings here, but they actually hold a church conference here in September of 1846. Now I couldn't track down the source of this, but I have it on good authority, and that's Barb Walden, that at these pulpits here, Strang preached for 8 hours. Now I have been in some very long meetings here, but I can't imagine. So at that 1846 September conference, the High Council, Strang's High Council, they discuss the issue of spiritual wifery and decide to disavow anyone who's involved in it, which is really interesting because Strang had just recently connected with John C. Bennett, and that's bad news. And Strang eventually takes up polygamy, even though his High Council in this space disavowed anyone involved in polygamy. So all of this catches up with him about 3 years later. And Strang's secret extra plural wife, who was dressing as a man and presented as Charlie, a secretary. Charlie is found out to actually be a woman at a Strangite conference. And we are going to then enter a figure that is one of my favorite in church history, and is that of Van Dusen, Increase Van Dusen. So Lorenzo Dow Hickey records, Van Dusen assaulted Strang by thrusting his hands into his face and breast and screaming to the highest pitch of his voice, "You are guilty, you are guilty, you are guilty," insulting and grossly abusing him, end quote. Increase, like I said, is a favorite of mine. One of my favorite stories of him takes place at these pulpits. It's recorded by the Painesville Telegraph, which is not a friendly source to the Latter-day Saints and not always reliable. But the Telegraph says this: a Mr. Van Dusen from Brooklyn has for 2 or 3 Sabbaths past been edifying a few addled-headed people with a spiritual Mormon exhibition in the temple. He asserts, and the Mormons believe, God has sent him on a mission to this place. His language is in an unknown tongue, imitating the howling of a drunken rowdy and the barking of a cur. A resident interpreter of tongues tenders into English the Bacchanalian, as well as the canine language, for the edification of the saints. So that's taking place here in the temple with Increase Van Duzen. All right, who do we have next? Looks like Lach.
Let's turn to Joseph's brother, William Smith, the only surviving Smith brother after Samuel's death, which occurred just a month or so after Joseph and Hiram's death. So he is an apostle. Prior to Joseph's death, he edited the Wasp, a Nauvoo newspaper, although it was, as the name suggests, not very friendly to our neighbors, so they end up renaming it The Neighbor. He's elected to the Illinois State Legislature for Hancock County. I think he's serving with Abraham Lincoln. He also becomes a member of the Council of 50, and this becomes very important. He works carefully with Brigham Young and the 12 and manages to kind of negotiate his way into being ordained presiding patriarch after Joseph's death. That becomes very important because Joseph had made some statements prior to his death suggesting that the patriarch was the highest office in the church. Statements like the patriarch over the whole church. And the 12 had published a newspaper article suggesting that William would hold, all the rights and authority that Hiram had held. And Hiram had been, prior to Joseph's death, a president of the church. And some believe Joseph had kind of turned things over to Hiram in some ways. So William was using that authority to try and outmaneuver Brigham and other members of the 12. He, of course, was not successful in that, and he was excommunicated in 1845. He initially supports James Strang, serves as an apostle and patriarch for Strang, but then is excommunicated by Strang in 1847. He starts to work with Isaac Sheen, very talented newspaper writer and editor, and they start to have some success putting a church organization together in Palestine Grove, basically Amboy, Illinois. And they're doing really quite well. Isaac Sheen is editing the Aaronic and Melchizedek Herald, and people like W.W. Blair end up affiliating with them. So in a number of cases, William is putting together the church organization that would become the foundations in some ways of the reorganization, in addition to followers of James Strang. But William actually is doing some very important work that he does not benefit from eventually, because William eventually is tricked into admitting by Isaac Sheen that he is secretly involved in the practice of polygamy. So Sheen, of course, kicks him to the curb. William also had been working with Lyman Wight and kind of coordinating with Lyman Wight, both lifting up the idea of lineal succession and Joseph Smith III leading at some future point. But again, they end up breaking over some of William's practices. By 1855, he seems to be working with Martin Harris in Kirtland, and then he ends up serving in the Civil War, joins the reorganization in 1878. He married 5 times, not including plural wives, and he was quick to lose his temper and quick to lose his friends as a young man, but really very much mellowed in his later years and became a much respected minister and chaplain during the last 30 years of his life, living in northeastern Iowa. He had negotiated with Joseph III for a number of years, hoping to become the presiding patriarch for the reorganization. Joseph III wasn't going to do that. So when William joined, it was as a high priest, and he continued kind of working with his nephew, hoping to become the presiding patriarch. Joseph III outlasted him. And it was not until after William's death that Alexander Smith became the first presiding patriarch in the reorganization. The artifact we have is a pamphlet that William wrote. So William Smith on Mormonism, a true account of the origin of the Book of Mormon. It's published in Lamoni, Iowa, printed by the Herald Steam Book and Job Office. So I think it's kind of interesting. It's not a publication of the church. It's a publication of William Smith, published for him. I'm sure he's paying for it by Herald House. Comes out in 1883. Kyle Walker, in his William Smith in the Shadow of the Prophet, is a nice description of this publication. It's 41 pages. It's really an autobiography of William, but focuses very much on the earliest days of the church. It's advertised in the Herald for sale for 25 cents a copy, and it sold out by 1885. William hoped to print a second edition and asked RLDS leaders to sponsor that second edition. He also hoped to enlarge the second edition to talk about what caused Joseph and Hiram's death. That made Joseph III and other leaders nervous because, of course, plural marriage is swirling at Joseph and Hiram's death. So they decided it was best to avoid that. It does seem that a second edition was printed in 1885, but there were no changes made to it, not even the date. So even the second edition carries the 1883 date. It was during William's writing of this pamphlet that Joseph III writes the letter that you perhaps have seen quoted, where Joseph III is encouraging his uncle, this is 1882, to fail to remember anything that might reflect poorly on Joseph and Hiram. So they knew that William had insider information about plural marriage in Nauvoo, and they were nervous about the damage that might do. So this is the result of William's efforts, again, carefully guided by Joseph Smith III.
This is all good stuff. And friends, we promised ourselves that each artifact was going to be about 3 minutes in length, the story behind the artifact, but the details are just so good. I thank you for letting us take some extra time as we go into all of these wonderful historic details about the people, let alone the artifacts that they left behind. So next on the list is David Whitmer. That should be a familiar name from church history. David Whitmer was one of 3 Book of Mormon witnesses and one of the earliest members of the church. He'd be considered a founding member of the 1830 church. He served as the Missouri Stake president in the 1830s, eventually had a falling out with Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon during the Far West period that eventually led to his leaving the church and them officially excommunicating him not long after he resigned. Now, the artifact we have to share tonight is David Whitmer's trunk. And this may look familiar to you as it's on display in the Church History Museum in the Temple there in Independence. Now, according to David Whitmer's great-granddaughter, Helen Van Cleve Blankenship, David kept the Book of Mormon printer's manuscript along with a family Bible and first edition of the Book of Mormon in his trunk. And it was a trunk that he placed under his bed. And there's all sorts of family stories about how David felt that this trunk kept him safe. And one of those stories that generation after generation told was about how he tucked it under his bed and a tornado came through his town, destroying nearly everything around his house except for the room that he was in with the trunk. So this was most certainly a family treasure. Well, in the late 1840s, William McClellan tried to convince David Whitmer to stake his claim to leadership of the church. And it seems that McClellan took it a step farther in leading up a small group of David Whitmer's followers, calling themselves the Church of Christ in Kirtland in the late 1840s. Well, Whitmer never made it back to Kirtland, and his group in Ohio, that was more or less led by William McClellan, eventually dissolved. But not without a few good stories, which I'm hoping Seth will share with us next about William McClellan during his time in Kirtland.
So 1 year after the Strangites had possession of the temple, it's 1847, and McClellan's group is here with, well, they claim possession of the temple, but the story is really interesting, right? So at the same time, Brigham Young is out west, and of course 47 is when they arrived to the valley, and he sent Alman Babbitt back to Kirtland to try to sell the temple. And Babbitt had claimed he had some success, but the sale fell through. So about that same time, this conference with the McClellanites is taking place, and Almon Babbitt is had it with these squatters in his mind. So he goes to the sheriff, and the sheriff says, all right, let's get them out. So quoting from an account by Amos Babcock, it says that on the 19th of June, the day of McClellan's conference, the sheriff did possess the defendants of the temple and put the agent, this Brigham's agent, in possession of the same, delivering him the key. This deranged the appointment of the conference to be held in the temple. Some rude boys soon, through a window, got possession. The agent, in trying to dislodge them, opened the door, and some of the McClellanites took forcible possession and took off one lock, but for some reason replaced it when the agent again locked it and secured the windows. You imagine they're just going in circles, opening and closing, locking and unlocking. All right, the doctor, McClellan, held his conference in the AM at his own house, but to fulfill all righteousness, or which the doctor thinks the same, the prophecy that his conference should be held in the temple, one of his most valiant men with an axe made a way, a highway, that's in capitals, a highway through a window and got into the house. The door was opened and a Jack McClellanite made the keeper, who committed assault and battery on the agent, who held the keys of the house on his attempting to enter it. The conference ended that afternoon and adjourned to next May. Pretty exciting stuff going on inside the temple here. All right, so next up, we've got Lach telling us about Lyman Wight.
Thank you. You see an image of what appears, what we understand to be Lyman Wight's cabin at Adam on the Almond. Lyman, of course, was part of Sidney Rigdon's All Things Common group. He is ordained an apostle in 1842, and he leads the efforts in the Wisconsin pineries. They are harvesting lumber to raft down the Mississippi to Nauvoo, and much of the Nauvoo building boom is courtesy of Lyman Wight and his group in the pineries. He also, by the spring of 1844, is a member of the Council of 50. And I know we keep coming back to the Council of 50, but it really was critical in the understanding of a number of these leaders on why they had authority to lead. Again, they somehow understood that the Council of 50 was more important than the church organizational structure, that it empowered them in ways that were not bound by the church organizational structure. So Lyman, a member of the Council of 50, Joseph had given Lyman a mission to Texas, and apparently had ordained him to go in a way that Lyman felt was the most critical mission. It was what the purpose of his life was, he felt. So even after Joseph's death, and despite the other members of the 12 telling him not to go, he led a group to Texas. And soon is working with William Smith to lift up the concept of lineal succession. Lyman supported many different leaders at different times, didn't really lift up his own claim, but felt strongly that Joseph had commissioned him to go to Texas, and he was going, and eventually was excommunicated by those who had followed Brigham Young to the west. The object that we're going to look at, I love. So the backstory on this is that I was visiting Bill Moraine in Lamoni years ago, and Bill had been working with the collections at Graceland and showed me a little hymnal that I had never seen before. You see a picture here. That's a Latter-day Saint hymnal, obviously printed in Austin in 1847. Again, I've never seen it. And I went home and started Googling it and discovered that at that point, it seemed anyway, there were no known copies of this hymnal, that Graceland had one, but it had been stolen. And the only reason people knew it existed is that BYU had a photocopy. At some point, though, an institution that ended up with it realized that it belonged to Graceland and sent it back. And so what you see here is the only known copy of Lyman Wight's 1847 Austin, Texas hymnal. The details I'll share come from Peter Crawley's A Descriptive Bibliography of the Mormon Church. So this hymnal includes 63 numbered hymns and one unnumbered, which is Ado to Honor, Wealth, and Fame. Also in this little booklet, Eliza R. Snow's The Assassination of Generals Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, which I think is a poem, and a first line index. 53 of the hymns in this little booklet are also in the 1841 Nauvoo hymnal, so they're adapting and adopting a lot of them from the Nauvoo hymnal. A hymn that I did not see, but I want to go look at some point just because I'm interested. Austin Cowles wrote a hymn that's in this little booklet, But Hark and Hear the Joyful Sound. The inscription in this book is to Dawn from Grandma Ballantyne. I do not know who Grandma Ballantyne is, but one of Lyman Wight's plural wives was Margaret Ballantyne. So it would be really interesting to try and establish if Grandma Ballantyne could also be Margaret Ballantyne, who might have owned this hymnal.
All right. So I have with me a very important artifact that if you come to Kirtland, you can see within the museum. This is the Brooks-Huntley Book of Mormon. Zadok Brooks is one of the lesser known, although these are all really obscure, but lesser known leaders in Kirtland as part of the succession crisis. And he, with the help of Russell Huntley, who paid for this, was able to produce 2 editions of the Book of Mormon, somewhere between 1856 to 1859. Now, the really interesting thing about this, the Brooks-Huntley Book of Mormon is a long name, but there really is another name involved right before that. So I'm going to put this down. All right. So there was a non-Latter-day Saint in New York. His name was James Wright. He was a publisher. And he noted that the Book of Mormon had gone out of copyright. And so for that, he decides, well, I'm going to print the Book of Mormon, but as the introduction, I'm going to have an anti-Mormon intro. So this is why these people are terrible, but here, read their book. And as Douglas Campbell writes in his 1996 dialogue article, Wright's edition did not sell well. This should come to no surprise to anyone who has tried to give the books away during their mission. Okay, well, I can account for that. So what does he do? Well, you've got these followers in Kirtland who are interested in his edition as long as they can put their own introduction on it. And so that's where Huntley comes in. They slap a new introduction on it. And not only is it used by that small group, Zadok Brooks' small group, but it becomes really important for the reorganization because it's their primary Book of Mormon until the Plano edition is printed several years later. And Joseph Smith III said, after the decline of the Brooks, or excuse me, not quoting yet, after the decline of the Brooks faction, Elder Huntley had a large number of these books on hand, many of which he gave away. This is the quote from Joseph Smith III. Long before he united with us, we sold these books for him and paid him for hundreds of them. That's in the Saints Herald, January 15th, 1881. All right, I have the next one too. Give me 1 second. Get this account. So we go forward a few more years, and this is an account given by W.W. Blair in 1860. So it's late in 1860, and there had been several groups gathered in the temple. Of course, we know what happens in 1860, and so people had gathered to talk about the ordination of Joseph Smith III. Martin Harris was in the group. There's a Strangite elder in the group. There's a Brighamite elder in the group. There's a Josephite elder in the group. So imagine the temple filled with all these different factions of the restoration, these competing organizations. So there's a long discourse by the Utah elder, and then W.W. Blair, who's an RLDS apostle, he reports that someone walks in. He says, a tall, long-haired, blue-eyed, ashy complexioned, but well-dressed man arose and demanded to know what practical thing the Mormons proposed doing in Kirtland. Well, when the Strangite elder, Leonard Rich, attempted to answer, again, this is quoting W.W. Blair, the long-haired stranger sprang to his feet, uttered an unearthly yell, hissed, stamped his feet, shook his head, and looked like the embodiment of evil. If you haven't guessed already, it's Increase Van Dusen at it again. All right, so Blair continues. Mr. Rich, the Strangite, at once dropped into his seat, and the stranger, too many strangs, sprang, and strangers. The stranger sprang upon the partition between the seats. Okay, so the partitions between the seats are the pew boxes. So imagine him striding across the pew boxes here, and he's forcing his way to the front, and people are starting to lose it. They are scared, right? And it continues, the quote continues, Martin Harris, who sat on my left, whispered to me saying, I guess he got the devil in him. Well, later, as people are rushing out of the temple, they start calling Increase, not Increase Van Dusen, but Increase Van Devil. He's buried in the Kirtland Cemetery not far from here, and the newspaper account paints him as a really lovely, calm person, but the accounts that we have from Latter-day Saint history tell us a different story. All right, Lach, do you have the last one?
I think I do. So Joseph III references Increase's wife, Maria, as Sister Van Dusen at one point, making me think she might have affiliated with the reorganization. And W.W. Blair leaves 4 accounts, Seth, of what you just described. Each one gets progressively better, more detailed. And by the 4th one, Martin Harris turns to the person next to him and says, what do I do? And the person next to him says, it's not your service, get out. And they all start sprinting out of the building. And as everybody's fleeing, they knock over a young woman, and they think that she is dead. They think she's died. And the Reorganite elders lay hands on her and raise her from the dead. It's a lot of fun. So at least 4 accounts of that from W.W. Blair.
And with each
All right,
telling, it gets better and better.
Yeah, each telling better and better and more details. I think there's something to learn as historians there. All right, let's talk about the new organization and Joseph Smith III. The next slide will be Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley, who are critical to this story. Jason Briggs is in the Beloit, Wisconsin area, organized a branch there following James Strang. And then once they discover that Strang is secretly involved in plural marriage, they kick him to the curb. They follow William Smith for a while and then discover that he's secretly involved in plural marriage. We also had Zenas Gurley in Yellowstone, Wisconsin, with the Strangite branch. Again, they kick Strang to the curb. And those men and others slowly start coming together and really only have 2 things in common. They believe in monogamy. They think that's the appropriate form of Christian marriage. And they believe that a child of Joseph should lead someday. So they end up sending missionaries down and convincing Joseph III and Emma to join with them. Joseph III does that in 1860. They go to Amboy, Illinois, and formally affiliate. Joseph III had been elected Justice of the Peace in Nauvoo in 1857, starts serving in 1858, but then joins what would become the reorganization in 1860. And as you might imagine, some of the locals are not amused. They begin passing resolutions, township by township, forbidding Joseph Smith III from preaching or praying in those places. And that's problematic on many levels. And it made Joseph III really annoyed. He vowed that he would stay right here in Nauvoo and do as he pleased for a period of 5 years. In fact, he promised a good friend, George Edmonds Jr., a non-member friend of the church, who was very involved in the the Temple Lot case later in Jackson County, Missouri. But Edmunds very involved with the church through the years. But Joseph III had promised Edmunds he'd stay for 5 years. He did. He moves to to Plano, January of 1866. So got his 5 years in and then moved. By 1877, almost 400 citizens of Nauvoo sign a petition. You see one of the pages enlarged and all of the pages stitched together here, courtesy of Weldon Anderson, a photographer with the Church of Jesus Christ, who was kind enough to photograph that for us. So almost 400 signatures asking the reorganization and Joseph III to move their headquarters here to Nauvoo. So this is one of my favorite objects, to go from you cannot preach or pray here in 1860 to please move your headquarters here by 1877. I just think is stunning. I think that people realize that Joseph III's form of Latter-day Saintism was different than his dad's. It was not threatening. So they had visions of marching militias and gathered community in a way that would overwhelm the locals. They came to understand that was not Joseph III's vision. I'm also thinking that there was likely some interest in the economic opportunities that having the church headquartered here might bring. Nauvoo was struggling mightily by that time economically. It had been bypassed by all the railroads. Their attempts to get the U.S. Capitol, you heard me right, their attempts to get the U.S. Capitol moved to Nauvoo had failed by that time. They thought that it would be safe because it was nowhere near the sea, and that the limestone that Nauvoo is built on would be perfect for building all the national monuments and etc. So they had given up on the U.S. Capitol idea, and they turned their attention to the RLDS headquarters idea. So that's the Nauvoo Scroll Petition, 1877.
Lach, before we leave this slide, is this Louis Bideman's signature here? It looks like either Lieutenant Bideman or...
I think it's L.C. Bideman. Yep.
Great.
It's a lot of fun to go through those names, many German names. The Baxters, who were the Icarians that started Baxter's Vineyards. Just lots and lots of familiar names on the list.
Well, friends, we have gone on longer than anticipated, but I hope you have enjoyed this show and tell as much as the three of us have thoroughly enjoyed sharing the stories behind these scattered saints artifacts. We had to limit ourselves to 12 objects or 12 stories. Otherwise, we would go all night long telling these stories. And we still went past the time that we were allotted. So many of the historic individuals that we talked about tonight will be explored in greater detail over the next 6 weeks in this lecture series. And as promised, here's a brief overview of what to expect in the Stories of the Scattered Saints lecture series. Our next lecture, next Thursday, Daniel Stone will join us on October 20th to share the fascinating story of William Bickerton. Bickerton followed Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young for a period of time before branching out on his own to begin his own Latter-day Saint group. Daniel Stone will talk about Bickerton's journey and his attempt to separate the Book of Mormon from Brigham Young and the Utah Saints. It's a fascinating story. You don't want to miss it. Daniel Stone says that William Bickerton's church today is the third largest Latter-day Saint denomination. So come back next Thursday and Daniel Stone will tell you all about it. Unfortunately, the October 27th lecture with Vicki Speak is postponed to the spring 2023 lecture series. Vicki and her family's home happened to be on Hurricane Ian's path of destruction recently, and the hurricane has left a lot of damage to the Speak family home and their neighbors. So thank goodness Vicki and her family are safe, but they have a lot of repair and cleanup work over the next few months. So she's asked to postpone her lecture to next spring, which we're more than happy to do. And Vicki sends her regrets, but looks forward to sharing with you next spring all about James Strang and the followers of James Strang that would later become RLDS. Although we're going to miss Vicky speak, we are going to get a little bit of Strang history on Thursday, November 3rd with Amy DeRogatis. That's the first Thursday of November. Amy will join us to talk about James Strang's claims to succeed Joseph Smith Jr. and begin his ministry opposing plural marriage. However, she'll explain that things changed, and the majority of her lecture will be about Elvira Eliza Field, one of the most fascinating individuals in Latter-day Saint history. Dr. DeRogatis will talk about Field, her secret marriage to Strang, and for 6 months, how she dressed as his fictitious nephew, Charlie Douglas, and served as his personal secretary while they traveled on a missionary tour of the East Coast. Amy argues that this daguerreotype portrays Elvira Eliza Field during the period of time when she dressed as Charlie Douglas. This is going to be a great lecture on November 3rd, and I hope you will all join us. The following week, we welcome Stephen Buell to the online stage as he shares the story of Sutcliffe Maudsley, a profile painter during the Nauvoo period. This will not only be a great lecture for art lovers and fans, Stephen will also share Maudsley's unique journey as he immigrated to the US from England, initially joined Brigham Young's movement heading west, but eventually ended up with a reorganization in Iowa. It's a fascinating story with a lot of wonderful art pieces that will take place again on November 10th. So be sure to sign up. And then finally, we end the Stories of the Scattered Saints lecture series with Stephen Shields on November 17th. Steve will give the series finale lecture by pushing us forward from the Scattered Saints period, which we've talked about all night, to the 20th century, and a lecture that Steve's calling Divergent Paths of the Community of Christ, the Past 100 Years. He will show how that questioning and seeking that took place in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s continued throughout the 20th century. And you could argue it continues to modern day. Steve will talk about Community of Christ history with schism, beginning with the upheaval in the 1920s with President F.M. Smith and Supreme Directional Control, through the disruption over women in the priesthood that was set in motion by Wallace B. Smith and his 1984 revelation known as Section 156 of the Community of Christ Doctrine and Covenants. So it's going to be an awesome lecture series, and you can register to save your online seat for these lectures by going to our website at historicsitesfoundation.org. So now I've got to ask Lach and Seth, which one of these lectures are you looking forward to the most in the series?
Well, that is super hard to pick just one, right? The Charlie's a gal, that looks really exciting. Lach, are you muted?
I'm struggling to pick one because I'm really excited about all of them, but I haven't had a chance to listen to Steve Shields in a while, and since his new book is out, so I'm especially excited about that one.
All right, well with that, we'll bring our evening program to a close. Thank you, Lach and Seth, so much for spinning tales today about the Scattered Saints and sharing the artifacts. And thank you for joining us from historic Nauvoo and historic Kirtland. It was extra special sharing the stories from those historic places. And thank you, Peter, for helping us host the opening night for the Scattered Saints Lectures series. A big thank you to you, especially for helping out behind the scenes. And lastly, we thank everyone in the audience, our dear friends and church history enthusiasts. Thank you for joining us tonight, for your excellent questions, and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. We have much, much to be thankful for. So I encourage all of you to tune in next week as we gather with Daniel Stone to hear all about William Bickerton and to discover what Bickerton's life experiences reveal about the Latter-day Saint past. Follow the link that Peter will be dropping soon into the chat to register for next week's lecture. And again, it's happening on Thursday, October 20th at 7 p.m. Central. So until then, take care, everyone. Keep reading your church history and have a good night.